Hey guys, welcome to Star Wars Timeline. My name is Ben. Today is one of those really special days. I'm super thrilled to welcome to my podcast one and only Steve Perry, a science fiction and fantasy author, a film and television script author. He was nominated for an Emmy Award for several of his Batman animated series TV shows. I'm sure many of you guys grew up with those. He is also at one point is a martial arts instructor and even a private eye detective. Mr. Perry is best known for some of his popular sci-fi series, Medstar series. He has written over 50 full novels, and as well as popular novelizations such as The Mask, Man in Black, and many more. I mean, the list goes on. You have also worked on Conan the Barbarian, obviously Star Wars, one of the topics I'm thrilled to speak to you about. You've also written in the Tom Clancy's universe, Aliens, Indiana Jones, and as I said, the list just goes on. Mr. Perry, thank you so much for your time and being here. I'm so happy to welcome you. Where do we begin? Please tell us what motivated you. Why writing? Why was that your career path?
Well, I was always a reader. And at some point when you're reading, you start looking at some of the things you read and you go, well, I could write that. And the main motivation was my 11th grade English teacher, Marianne Brown, who was just gorgeous. She was probably 8 or 10 years older than the class. And I couldn't impress her. I was a little skinny geek, wore glasses, had nothing going for me. So I started writing fiction as part of the class. And she thought it was good. And so there you go. That put me on the road. You can impress women with your writing.
Was there any great contrast of sort of like an awakening between, hey, I could write a book or I could write a short story, and actually sitting down and doing it for the first time?
No, I think it's just one of those things you learn in training. For me, I like to read, and I wanted to write the kind of books that I would like to read if someone else had written them. So I actually started out writing short stories because that was the career path back in those days. They recommended you write short stories for the magazine, which there still were a number of them out there. That you work with the idea of getting your name known and having people recognize it. And when you had enough of a body of work, you could go to a book publisher and present your ideas and say, okay, this is what I have in mind. And so pretty much that's what I did. Oh, excuse me, my dog is making noise.
He's saying hello there. We have our canine bipedal creatures in Star Wars. I'm pretty sure Star Wars fans will be pretty comfortable with that. But, I'm also always curious where prominent people, whether, authors or filmmakers, where do they stop? What are the things that, influence those formative years in their early childhood? I was just curious, when you were a kid, if you can remember yourself, did you have any literature role models or perhaps writers that were influences on your style later on?
Oh, sure. I think everybody does. I think if you're an omnivorous reader, and I used to read everything from ketchup labels and cereal boxes to whatever I could get my hands on. My parents belonged to the Book of the Month Club, and they would bring these books in. And so I was reading Hemingway when I was 10 years old. I didn't understand it, but I could read it. And I wasn't forbidden to do that. But the kind of science fiction and fantasy that I really enjoyed when I was a kid, and there wasn't as much of it, was space opera. That's what Star Wars is. It's space opera. It's daring do. It's galactic empires. It's ray guns and rockets and martial arts and all those things. And I always found that stuff fascinating. So that's kind of the path that I worked my way to.
I find myself in a similar situation. I was living in Russia for my first 14 years of my life. Our father bought us this, what we call a library of books of international classics translated into Russian. And he just picked any book off the shelf and just ignited your imagination. So always when I read stuff, whether it's modern or a little bit older, and I'm so fascinated with the author's work, I'm like, what sparked that? Where did that come from? What that spark of imagination is? But speaking of science fiction, how would you differentiate it from your general fiction, something that perhaps existed with a fictional character in the world that we recognize, versus hardcore or fantasy or science fiction?
Well, the traditional definition is science fiction is a literature that if you take the science out, the story doesn't work. You need science as an integral part of the story. It doesn't mean it can't be a romance or Western or some other genre mixed in there. You have lots of detective science fiction. But the idea is that what you want is a story where Okay, you take the science out, and this story doesn't really work anymore. That's what
Mhm.
makes it. That's a traditional definition of science fiction.
Mhm. I've read somewhere some professional critics say that a lot of modern science fiction, quote unquote, cinema is only superficially touches upon real core scientific ideas, whereas something like Dune, obviously based on Frank Herbert's famous novel, taps into it a lot more. What do you find ourselves in as film audience, as literature audience today? Are we tapping into more something that's very on the surface level, or like deeper scientific ideas today?
Oh, I think there's a full range. You can range from. I mean, Star Wars is not science fiction in the sense that it could have been a western. It could have been an eastern. It could have been a samurai movie. In fact, some of the major influences of Star Wars are samurai movies. The idea is that you can go as far or as close as you need to. You can write something completely superficial. I mean, you can watch Superman, which is fantasy. There's not really a lot of science in how Superman has his powers, insofar as that I know. But you can also have different levels. You have the superficial level that the children can watch and go, "Wow, that's cool," and
Hmm.
then you go down a few levels and you see there's some subtext there and context that you can dig a little deeper and find out that if the writer's any good, sometimes there's stuff there between the lines. So yeah,
Hmm.
I don't a lot of the genre bending stuff, a lot of the stuff that's close to the edge. Is that science fiction? Is it fantasy? Is it mainstream with a science fiction element? Every once in a while, you'll see a mainstream writer who will pick up a science fiction idea and write it, and people go, "Oh wow, that's so terrific! No, nobody ever thought of that before." Oh, of course they did. They've been writing that for 100 years in science fiction. It's just that you haven't heard of it before because it was for the longest time science fiction and fantasy was the ghetto. It was one of those places that you went to and you knew the people around you and you enjoyed the literature, and it didn't transcend those. And of course, since Star Wars, there's an awful lot of science fiction and fantasy on in media now.
Right.
TV, movies, streaming, there's stuff there that before Star Wars just wasn't as prevalent.
Yeah. And I find myself generally anything that I pick up, it's a permutation always of styles, of genres, because every time, creators want to find their own unique voice. But I also wanted to ask you, what is your goal as an author? How did you decide to separate yourself from the crop? Because obviously there's tons of, popular sci-fi authors. What was your personal goal?
Well, I just want to tell a good story. I'm a big mystery fan. There was a writer that I grew up reading as a teenager, John D. MacDonald, who wrote a series of books about a guy who lives on a boat and he rescues damsels in distress and he recovers money for people, and that he lives off of his portion of what he does. And it was a very interesting idea. And somebody
Yeah.
asked, and MacDonald was a bestseller. He had movies made from his work. He wrote these series for years. And someone asked him, so what is your goal as a writer? He says, well, I want to tell a good story. If you tell a good story, if someone is going into a 7-Eleven store and they have enough money to buy a 6-pack of beer, but they choose to buy your book instead, and when they're finished, you want them to feel like they got their money's worth. You don't want them to regret not buying the beer. And
Right.
so the biggest part of this thing is if you tell an interesting story in a way that people can relate to it, then everything comes from that. As long as the story is interesting, you can take people down some really strange roads, and
Yeah.
they'll go with you.
It's such a basic idea. I tend to overthink things. Maybe there's like a grand plan or, as some kind of blueprint that, each author tries to pursue. But it's generally just like, hey, I just want to please fans. It's in a way almost like George Lucas talks about Star Wars and such a basic, fundamental core ideas that just resonate with people. I'm hearing the same sort of thing. For you, it's just that idea of pleasing your reader.
Of course, I mean that if you don't please the reader, you don't have readers, and they don't come back, and you don't sell books, and you don't make a living at it.
Yeah.
And so the essence of all this is Robert A. Heinlein came up with the three rules, the three plots at
Hmm.
some point. There's only three, he said, and there's variations on that, but his basic three plots was boy meets girl or a love story, the little tailor who's a story about adventures, all the stories of adventures, and then the man who learned better or the person who learned better.
Hmm.
And you could pretty much take any story that you've seen on movies, on TV, or read in a book of late, and you will find that it's gonna be one, two, or three of those plots. Those will all maybe going on in the same book, and it's just there just aren't that many new stories. We like the rule of three as a species, and we go down those roads. It's not so much that the story is different; it's who tells it and how.
Mhm.
That's the difference between the story I write and the story somebody else writes. Is that I told mine and he told his, or she told hers. That's how it goes.
Mhm. I remember first coming to America and being completely fascinated going to my first Barnes and Noble's experience, and it was just this vast, huge, towering shelves of science fiction and fantasy, and I felt so intimidated because A, I was only learning English, and second, I just didn't want to, in my teenage mind, deal with something that's mediocrity. I wanted to get to the top of the line, authors and read those first that everybody recognizes and build my way from there. But at one point I said, well, Ben, how about you pick up a book and just finish it and start reading? And some of the earliest stuff that I read in English were Star Wars book, and believe it or not, was actually Shadows of the Empire. I would sit with physical translator and translate word by word. At one point, you just get so frustrated, you set aside the translator and just you vibe with the book. You try to extract from it as much as possible, and that's how you learned.
Oh yeah, sure. Any experience is personal. I mean, any book experience. If it speaks to you, then it's good.
Yeah.
If it doesn't speak to you, then it doesn't matter whatever people think.
Mr. Perry, before we sort of move on and speak about, the general things I wanted to ask about on writing and get to Star Wars, I couldn't help but ask your martial arts background, specifically Silat. For those of you guys who are watching, two movies that popularized the Raid 1 and 2. Obviously, those who are interested in martial arts disciplines, in no shape or form am a martial artist, but I did practice Greco-Roman wrestling in Russia for like 2.5 years. I was fascinated. I looked at the pictures on Google of you, doing the poses, like, oh my God, okay, he also does martial arts. Add that to the pile. Like, what did you think of those films when you first saw them?
Oh, I thought they were great. The Salat is a relatively small art. There's not nearly as many practitioners outside of the old country.
Yeah.
In Indonesia, it was a village art. Every village had some teacher who was teaching martial art. And they didn't always call it Pencak Salat.
Mm-hmm.
They called it other things. They called it Kutao, and it depends on which region you were in. But there were a lot of people there, but it didn't translate as well. Some of the bigger martial arts, karate, judo, taekwondo, those have bigger followings. They started out with bigger followings, and they exported a lot of teachers.
Right.
In this country, probably there may be literally a handful of really seriously qualified teachers. Mm-hmm. And I've sort of found my way into the art because as I was writing my own stuff, I created martial arts on my own. I've been training for more than 50 years, different arts. And so at some point, I started making up my own, and I came up with methods for making them work and what they would do and the patterns they would use and the kind of weapons that they would use. And I found out that I had sort of accidentally replicated Pencak Salat, that a lot of what I was making up, somebody had already done, hundreds of years before I was born. And so it's like, well, and so I started looking around, and then I had a friend who's a martial artist and who's also a writer, Stephen Barnes, who writes a lot of action-oriented martial arts books. And he said he was training in this art. He said, you should come check this guy out. And so I did. And I signed up for the next class, and I've been there for, 25, 28 years, something like that now.
Mm-hmm. I used to work at the local comic book store here in New York City in the Bronx. And we had a section where we'd sell martial arts. And I remember when Tony Jaa exploded onto the scene with his Ong Bak, in the Tom Yam Goong films. There was a little bit of crossover, but some fans weren't versed enough. I guess it was just casual stuff, martial arts fans. They wouldn't recognize or separate between Silat, for example, and traditional Thai boxing. And we would sit down and learn about this stuff so I could, talk to my clients and tell them, hey, this is a different kind of movie. Check it out. And people, exploded with the Raid. It was just so popular.
Oh yeah, it's like anything else. There's all kinds. There's myriad martial arts. They're from all over the world. They have some similarities. A lot of them. Some of them are completely different. But the essence of these things is that at the high end they start to look alike because there's only so many ways to move efficiently, and either you're doing it efficiently or less efficiently.
Yeah.
And if it works, it's good. If it doesn't, and then there's sports, and then there's arts that are designed for self-defense. There's a South African knife art that's just designed to assassinate people, called Piper, and it
Right.
came out of the South African prisons. And these guys, they're just deadly with the blade. You just don't want to mess with them. They this is what they do. They can flip these knives back and forth and twirl them around and do all this stuff, and they can do this under combat conditions. So yeah, there's a whole wealth of stuff there, and it lends itself to any kind of action writing. I mean, you'll get to that, but there's Star Wars martial arts that I made up. In fact, it's become canon now.
Taras
They
Kasai.
use it in some of the movies.
Yes, or Teres Kazi, I'm sorry. Yeah. Also in regards to martial arts, as a part of Russia where I'm from, the southern part, the Caucasus Mountains, is a popular Azerbaijani wrestling called the Gunesh. And it also it was very interesting where you grow up in a culture where, there's kind of like a martial discipline where the young man needs to be sculpted and like a tempered with the martial, even though it's no longer used obviously for killing people, but it is used as a formative kind of instrument in a way to shape a young man, to make him understand what adversity is, to be respectful to his master, to his teacher. That's what I've sort of brushed up against when I was studying the Greco-Roman.
Well, every country has its own indigenous martial art. I remember when I was young reading about Russian Sambo, which was an art I had never heard of, and then I started reading. Oh, this is fascinating. It's wrestling. It's a wrestling art. There's basically only two martial arts: wrestling and boxing, and everything else is an offshoot of one of those two, or a combination. And of course, you get into weapons, but what you can do in Salat, what you can do empty-handed, you can do with a knife in your hand. So it's just a matter of degree. I'm going to pinch your head off. My dog wants me to scratch her.
Mr. Perry, if we could move on into writing, I just had a couple of questions for you, and then we'll jump into the topic that I'm pretty sure a lot of fans were like, Ben, make sure you ask this question, yes, that question, that sort of stuff on Star Wars. But you mentioned earlier that for a person to read a book, it's a very personal, intimate experience. What you have wrote, was introduced to your talent through your Star Wars books, and to me they represent not just the best of Star Wars bubble, but some of the best fiction I personally read. I wanted to ask this question. I hope it's not too obtuse. What separates a good book from a great book? Commercially speaking, what do readers gravitate towards?
They just want to be entertained. I think the idea that you take somebody on a ride and you put them into a world that they didn't imagine before, and you take them places they didn't think they could go, and you make it thrilling, and you make it interesting, and you make it exciting, and you make them laugh, and you make them cry. The definition of literature goes to time. Something that becomes literature does it over a period of time. When Dickens was writing his work, they were considered trash. They appeared in the newspaper, and people thought, oh, this is junk stuff. And then, come down the road. Well, when Shakespeare was writing, he was rewriting old stories he had heard and putting them forth. But the difference was he was pretty good at it. Dickens was pretty good at it. I think what you're looking at with good writing versus great writing is how relevant it is to how many people. If someone can pick up a book 100 years later in an entirely different culture, and get the essence of the story being told and enjoy it, and go on that ride, even though they don't have the context of those times, then it can become a great book. Any novel, any story that is complex enough and interesting enough to catch readers' attention in the time may fade. There are a lot of books that were very popular in their time, and then they disappeared. They didn't wear very well. They didn't stand the test of time. That's what I think a great book is. And it really doesn't have anything to do with sales. Some of the best writers who ever lived didn't make very much money as writers. Right. They some of the science fiction fantasy writers who were just absolutely wonderful writers were basically poor. And there are other people who write okay and make fortunes. And it just, to appeal to a wider audience, you have to have something that a lot of people can look at and relate to. Yeah, as a fan, for some odd reason, I never perceived it from this particular angle where it's really outside of the author's control. No matter how great of an author you are, no matter how well researched your work, if it simply doesn't pick up and doesn't interact with the audience, then you kind of sort of fail. It's in a way like what I was taught in an art school. Art is meant to communicate. And if it's sitting there hanging on your wall in your room, nobody's staring at it, it's not really art because you're not really communicating with anyone. And also in one of the how to write books, which I have several of, just like dabbling an idea like, hey, maybe I could write a short story one day, is always a segment where they talk about it's all about
the first page. You need to capture your reader within the first page. So, Mr. Perry, what do you personally set out to capture in that first chapter, perhaps?
Oh, yeah, the hook, the narrative hook, they call it.
Mm-hmm.
What you do is you want to catch the reader on the first page and make it so interesting that they need to turn the page to see what comes next. And you just keep doing that.
Right.
Some writers will work in a number of 800 word scenes. Some writers will start out with action. It doesn't have to start with action. It can start with dialogue. It can start with almost anything, as long as whatever is being put forth is like, that's interesting. I wonder what he's going to do with that. There's some great first lines that just compel you to keep reading. But if at the end of the first page, the reader is going, I think I'm going to go to bed now, I'm really tired, then you haven't done your job. The job of an artist is to do a cover that will get people to pick the book up.
Right.
And the job of the writer begins when they open the first page. And so I think the thing to do is that there's a writing term called immediate rest. It's in the middle of things. Mm-hmm. And what they tell you in some of the, especially genre fiction, is that there are certain accepted memes, I guess, themes that you're okay to use. If in Westerns, they used to tell you in the pulp days, well, you shoot the sheriff on the first page. You chase your hero up a tree and throw rocks at him. You start out in a situation in the middle of something where like, what's going on? But whatever it is interesting. It doesn't have to be, somebody being shot at. But certainly, if the scene opens up with a guy coming at you with a sword, it does make you stop and think. Okay, so what are we going to do now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even the Star Wars, right? The original 1977 film begins where I studied animation and film here in New York City in the School of Visual Arts, and my storyboard teachers and script writing teachers were telling me that every great story takes place outside the screen, and you only get to the good part at the end. So when you look at the original film, it pretty much happens at the end. And I feel that part of that thrill is that we're thrown into this world, and here's all the excitement, and it trusts into the viewer's intelligence to pick up on, giving them enough kind of like hints to try to pick up what the story is outside of the scope of the screen.
Yeah, you can always go back. You can do this call backfill. You go back and you say, okay, well, this is what happened. You can have somebody explain it, or you can have a flashback, or you can have a painting on the wall that someone looks at and asks a question of it. The idea is once you get someone started down the road and they build a certain amount of inertia, they're moving. They're going to keep moving until you give them a reason to stop. So you don't give them a reason to stop. You don't stop in the middle of an interesting scene and give them a boring scene. You just keep things rolling along.
Yeah.
In an ideal book, you want like a sine wave. You want that up and down flow of interesting, slow, fast, slow. So that, and as you get closer to the end, it gets higher and higher and higher, and then you get to the roller coaster where you fall off at the end. That's the idea of, I think, an interesting story. It's just so compelling that you can't stop. The best compliment that you can get as a writer is, oh, you miserable son of a bitch. I couldn't put it down. I was up all night reading your book, and I was late to work, and, too bad, sorry, but that's my job.
There's very few books that I knew in the bottom of my heart that they are page turners because I have firsthand experience. That before I've wrestled with the term, I couldn't understand what people mean by it. Like, what do you mean page turner? And then there were a few books that I did read, like, oh, those are basically all-nighters.
Yeah. I'll just read a little bit more. Just a little bit more. Watch
just another one. And you look at the clock, it's like 4 o'clock in the morning. Like, oh my God, I need to go to work. The last question I have on generally on writing is, so I came to the U.S. in 1996, right? I'm 41. So I started getting into Star Wars and other science fiction around the early Bantam era, like 97, 98, 95, somewhere around there. And I hear amongst Star Wars fans, this was actually one of the questions that people wanted to ask me, is that some of this earlier Star Wars stuff that people talk about, for example, one of my favorite Star Wars books to this day, Children of the Jedi, by Barbara Hambly, right? I reviewed this book also. Some fans that I talk to, I don't take offense. Everybody has a taste. Everybody has a personal preference. But there's this term that gets thrown around a lot. People say, oh, it's cheesy, it's aged. It's so 90s science fiction, blah, blah, blah. I wanted to take your personal, opinion on this, your impression. what are some core elements of science fiction that can't be cheesy, that they stand the test of time and could be interesting in mid-90s or like in 2022?
Well, first thing is character. You have to have characters that are interesting and that change.
Mm-hmm.
You start out at point A and you end up at point Z, and you can't be the same at the end as you were at the beginning, because if you are, it's not good fiction. Fiction is about change. Good fiction. I mean, I used to write Conan novels, and Conan is the same at the end of the book as he was at the beginning, because you can't change him, because we have his arc from the time he was 16 until he was 65.
Mm-hmm.
There were stories and books written in there, and you can't go in and cut off his arm when he's 30 because he still has it when he's 60. Mm-hmm. So you can't really mess with him too much. So then you go play with the villains, because the villains can be more interesting. Generally speaking, villains are more interesting to write because they can do things that the hero's not supposed to do. I think probably the essence of a story is, I mean, again, because there aren't that many new story ideas. The stories are very similar. Cultures around the world have the same kinds of stories, but there are. It is how does the actors, the protagonists, the antagonists, how do they deal with these ideas, and what do they do? And in order to make it work and keep going, you have to have people that people can identify with. You don't have to like them. I mean, you don't have to think, well, Darth Vader's a really nice guy. No, he's not. He's a murderer. He's redeemed at the end, but he killed an awful lot of people on his way there. That doesn't really excuse his behavior, that, he had one good moment at the end. Other than that, he was, basically pretty much, kill anybody who happened to get in his way. That's hard to do with, but you don't have to like him. You just need to understand why he's doing this. And that's what the backstory, that's what the movies are about. How did he get to be Darth Vader? How did he go from the sweet little pod racing kid? How did Anakin turn into Darth? And that's the essence of change. Not everybody changes for the better. You want to start out, well, I know this, and by the time I get to the end, I'm going to be smarter and more compassionate, more loving. I will have learned a lesson. I'll have had a come to realize moment that it makes my life better. But not everybody goes that road. And so whatever characters you put forth, if you want to have a villain, it can be just a mustache twirler, someone who's just villainous to be villainous. It's ever so much more interesting to have a villain who's doing what he thinks is the right thing for the right reasons, but he's wrong.
Yeah. There's also a big rift that was started, when the Star Wars sequels were coming out and people had impossible expectations. And of course, the Episode 7 comes out, The Last Jedi, and the portrayal of Luke Skywalker. I also made a video on this, that a lot of fans were either not interested in seeing this version of Luke Skywalker, or they were saying this is basically not my Luke Skywalker at all. And I drew a parallel between this version of Luke Skywalker versus Frank Herbert's Paul Atreides, who in the second book, Dune Messiah, completely transforms, which was a very intentional move on the author's behalf to say, like, look, never meet your heroes twice, sort of classical mythological motif where people change and evolve through time, and by the time you meet them when they're like in their 50s or 60s, they're completely changed, for better or for worse, but they become completely different people.
One of the things that makes young heroes dying young interesting is that you don't get to see that. You don't know whether they would have gotten better. Where Bruce Lee is still considered an icon of martial arts. He died in his early 30s. Had he lived to be 60 or 70 years old, what would he have become? He would have changed. If he had stayed in martial arts, he would have had to change, because you can't do the same things when you're 70 years old that you could do when you were 25 years old and you worked out 4 hours a day and you could jump up and kick an apple off the top of a basketball player's head. Those days are numbered.
Yeah.
You can be young and strong for a while, and at some point you will not be young and strong. I think anytime you have a character who goes through changes, and anytime you have a series as big as Star Wars, and the other problem with the prequels, the Star Wars movies, was the way that they were done on sequels. Everybody assumes George Lucas had in mind this whole series when he started. He didn't.
Yeah.
He didn't. He had an idea of which ways he could go, but he didn't expect the movie to be nearly as successful as it was, and then so he had to figure out where it was going to go from there. Part of the biggest problem is that Star Wars, when the first movie was made, Episode 4, it was just a lark. It was fun. It was a Saturday morning serial in the movies. It was all all of the kung fu and Western tropes and all this stuff, and everybody was just having a great old time, and nobody had ever seen anything like it. So here was this wonderful thing. The second movie was much better. I mean, insofar as the plot and the characterization and stuff, it just, but it wasn't as new. It was different, and every subsequent movie that comes along, people have higher and higher expectations. So part of the biggest problem is, and I don't mean this as any detriment to George and the people at the ranch, is they started taking it pretty serious. It's like, oh my gosh, we have to really do well here. It has to mean something. It can't just be a bunch of people having fun riding around the galaxy like, a bunch of kids. We have to, there's a religion in England, the Jedi, all this stuff it's developed this huge importance. And at some point you can overthink it. You can just, it's the advice I always give writers, and people say, what about style? What about theme? What about, moods? Don't worry about it. Just tell the story. If you tell a good story, all the rest of the parts will come forth. They'll have to be part of the good story. And so you have these expectations that, oh, well, this has to mean something. Now, it can't just be a bunch of people out flying around the galaxy and good guys, bad guys. Yes, it can. It can always be that. And you can layer on more stuff as you get better, and you can still keep it interesting. And when it stops being interesting, people are going like, oh, well, this is not as good as the first one was. Well, the other thing too is when I saw the first one, I was young. I had just started writing. I was I had never seen anything like that. And then as I got older and as I learned more about it and became part of the process and actually got to write the universe, it changed the way that I look at those things. And I'm never going to be able to see a brand new Star Wars movie the way I saw it. I don't have the young eyes anymore. I'm not someone who's going to look at that and go, yes, when that ship goes spinning off, and I don't need any spoilers, but the Darth Vader ship goes sailing off into the realm, going, sequel. I was thinking to myself, sequel. He's going to have to do another because he's not dead. And those are the kind of things that, and so part of that process, it's like the music you listen to growing up is not going to be the same music that your son or your grandson listened to growing up. Although they may hear it, they may, well, this is Grandpa's music and he likes it, but it's you can't go back and be young again. So you have to deal with the fact that back in my day things were much better. Well, it was because I was much younger and I had a different mindset
and a different person. Yeah, it's, that innocence is lost when you first encounter something great and beautiful, and it's so embedded in your childhood memories of perhaps like a family experience. Like in my case, my dad showed it to me for the first time, the Star Wars trilogy on a VHS tapes back in Russia. It's all these different experiences. And not only do we change as audience, as viewers, the filmmaker, George Lucas, changes. Perhaps he wants to try different things, and now he's constricted by all these expectations, and people don't like Jar Jar and this or that. And I feel like, in a way, things have become so much more industrialized and serialized and off the conveyor belt that there's not as much of playfulness and kind of like throwing your dice over there and just trying to see what chance happenstance kind of story you can come up with that it will either stick and people will embrace it, or it will completely crash and burn. You have to start from a clean slate.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody that's involved with Star Wars, everybody that writes it or reads it or watches it or listens to it has expectations that they bring to it. And sometimes they will do things that I will look at and go, I wish you hadn't done that. It'd have been better just to leave it a mystery, what the Force comes from. We don't need to come into some esoteric explanation that you're going to explain how the Force works physically. I don't need to know that. It wasn't necessary for my enjoyment. And if anything, it's like, where'd you pull that from, George? You don't need to tell anybody about it. They don't need to know that stuff. It's not important. The story is that these are people who have this thing. And of course you want to explain. And that's the other part is as a writer, as a creator, the older you get, the more you know, the more you want to explain to people how things work. And you tend to get wordier. You tend to want to, I'm just going to tell you how this works because it's so much fun. I enjoyed playing with it so much. I'm going to bring that to you.
So guys, moving on to Star Wars now, right? I'm just going to give like a very, very brief intro. Perhaps not as many people as I like today know about the Shadows of the Empire. So the whole thing started as a massive publishing campaign at Lucasfilm. It was a huge crossover multimedia event. It included a novel, Steve Perry, comics, Kenner toys, a soundtrack, video game. I believe it also had its own audiobook back in the day. And basically, Lucasfilm publishing director Lucy Wilson and Bantam editor Lou Aronica, they met, and they basically were interested in reinvigorating the franchises on the heels of Star Wars Special Edition that George Lucas spent $60 million on, cleaned them up, added a couple of extra effects, and that was about to sail off onto the screens and being reintroduced to a whole new generation of Star Wars fans. Mr. Perry, you sort of started already talking about this, but I just wanted to ask once again, prior to being invited specifically for this project, my understanding is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that this is your first Star Wars work. What was your relationship with the Star Wars films, specifically as a fan?
Oh, I loved them. I thought they were terrific. I mean, how could you not? He's a science fiction fantasy writer. Here comes Star Wars. It's brand new. It's interesting. It's fascinating. It is exciting, and it's fun. And so, well, how could you not go down that road? I mean, it didn't scare anybody else. It didn't stop anybody else from writing any other kinds of science fiction. It's like a rising tide. It kind of lifted all boats. Yeah. So that if you were a writer, I wrote a short story about the time Star Wars came out, which was very similar, about an alien who learned an unbeatable martial art using something called the wave, which was the Force. And this was an old concept. It's key. It's key. Right. It's been in martial arts forever. Right. People go, well, did he steal your? No, he didn't steal my idea. Nobody stole that idea. That idea has been around for 1,000 years. Yeah. It is a matter of, he just presented it in a way that was interesting and different. So I liked it. I thought it was great. And the way I got into it was quite simply, there was a movie made called The Mask, which starred Jim Carrey. Right. And it's a kind of a cartoonish superhero magical mask thing. One of my favorite childhood movies. Well, and it was written by Dark Horse. It was a Dark Horse comic before it became a movie. And so the editor of the tie-in, the movie tie-in, named Tom Dupree. He was at Bantam, and I'd been working with him doing Aliens books, for Bantam, and he knew who I was, and so he said, "Look, I've got this movie novelization I need to have done, and here's the problem: I need it fast." I think another writer got offered the job and dropped out or fell out, and so he said, "I need it pretty quick. I don't really have much money, you'd be doing me a favor if you did this thing." And so I'd never done a movie novelization at that point. I thought, oh, that sounds like fun. So he sent me the script, and I wrote the book in 18 days, which is my personal record. I had the script, so it's easier to expand from a script. It was still a lot of writing, and he was happy. And I didn't make a lot of money, but it was kind of like, well, this is fun. And I had another tie-in through Mike Richardson at Dark Horse Comics, because he had a shop a couple of miles from my house, and I used to take my son there to buy comic books at Dark Horse Comics. Before it was Dark Horse, before it became Mike Richardson, he was the guy sitting behind the counter at the comic book store, and we used to talk about all this stuff. So when the Aliens novelizations came along, he remembered me. He called me up and said, "Would you be interested in doing those?" So I got those, and through those I got the novelization for The Mask, and then through that I got a shot at Star Wars because Tom Dupree said, "Oh, you want?" I said, "Okay." He said, called up. He said, "Would you be interested in doing the Star Wars novel?" "Oh yeah, no question." He said, "Well, it's about. I don't care what it's about. I'll do it." And so he said, "Well, these are good people. You'll have fun." And they flew me out to the ranch, and I took my notebook and we went from there. That's basically how I got. How much freedom did they give you? Because my understanding is that early Bantam era, early Star Wars, I mean, we're talking about Tim Zahn, we're talking about Kevin J. Anderson, and Kenneth Flint, that I got to interview, the author of the unpublished The Heart of the Jedi book. There were, Mr. Kenneth Flint told me that it was pretty much an open field, and they were kind of like telling authors, "Hey, just help us create this universe." In your case, how much freedom did they give you? Oh, I had a lot. It was interesting. They had a general idea. In fact, I'll tell you the story about the Star Wars compendium of planets. I asked him at one point, when I first got into it, do you have a map? I mean, the galaxy would. Right. No, we don't have any of that stuff. We just, every writer comes in and writes his own stuff, and we just throw it out there, and we hope some of it sticks. And so I had a fan send me a note saying, "I've been keeping track of all this stuff. I know where all the planets are and how many people were there and what was done. Would you be interested in reading it? And I said, oh, yes. And so he sent me a copy of the thing. It was an ASCII file. That's how long ago it was. And I read this thing. I thought, this is wonderful. So I called up Lucasfilm, Lucy Wilson and the crew that I was working with there. And I said, you need to read this because this guy's got all this. And they did. And they read it and they bought it. And it became the basis for their Star Wars, map basically of where the planets were and all. You could just make stuff up because you didn't have to know anything. You didn't have to. Well, I'll just make up a new system. I don't have to worry about something that's already out there and screwing it up. But yeah. So when I first went, they had was an idea that they wanted the villain. They wanted it to be dark. Mm-hmm. They had Xizor. I think Lucy Wilson came up with Xizor because the name is Portuguese. That sound X is an SH sound. And she had a boyfriend. Or knew somebody who was a guy that had a name that has it's like Razor with Xizor, and so they had the villain, and I knew what he looked like. He was kind of a reptilian looking thing. They had a couple of ships. I think Chen had designed a couple of spaceships, sort of general idea, and pretty much the story that they wanted to tell was about the mob, the mafia, the underground. And how would that go? And so we sat in a room with 20 people around a big table, and we just started spitballing ideas. I said, "What about this? What about that?" Somebody else would say, "Well, I need to have this." And what about this? And I want Boba Fett. And the comic book people, everybody had a piece of the pie that they were interested in doing.
Right.
So I just took notes, and I was making. I said, "Okay, well, what about this? Do we need to have a motorcycle chase scene? We need to have this." And there's a game people saying, well, we need to do this. And so I just basically voluminous notes. I had a notebook full of stuff, and I went home and I sat down and I just made up the rest of the story to go with all the notes that I already had. Everybody's input was there.
Right.
And so it's just, okay, so I'll just blend this into something that very collaborative, very much so. Everybody had a piece of it. And I said, okay, this is a story, and this is the guy, and these are his qualities, and this is what's good about him. And by the way, I'm going to put in a human replica droid here who looks gorgeous, just like Brigitte Bardot from the old movies, and who has these abilities. I'm going to run through all this stuff and put it together. And so I did an outline, which is probably the longest outline I had ever done. It was very detailed. It was probably 25 single-space typewritten pages, which is a fairly long for a book outline. But I knew that everybody else involved with the process was going to be using this as their jumping off point. And so I sent the outline in, they read it, they passed it around, I got notes, I got approval, and once the outline was set, and from that point on, there was not much variation allowed because we were all going to follow the same outline. So the idea was, okay, this is not set in stone, but it's certainly not set in sand either. We're going to, if you get too far away from these general parameters, you're going to mess the thing up. So that's what we did. That's how it worked. And I had a couple of things that you probably read the story, but in the writing of it, I'll get back to that.
Yeah. I also was very quickly curious, just a brief note there. So I got a huge honor to get to interview Greg Hildebrand of the Hildebrand brothers. He is not just my role model. I think he's one of the greatest fantasy science fiction illustrators of all time. He's tremendous.
No question.
Yeah. And he was telling his part of the story that him and his late brother Tim were invited to also participate in it, and how they were introduced to a live model, a young man who was fully dressed up, and they were basically vibing off him and creating their painting together of this Dash Rendar. Now, the character also was sort of summarized or visually created before you got to write him, correct?
Yes. Some of them were. The Xizor, the main character, there were 3 or 4 different sketches from different artists, but I had an idea of generally what he looked like. He was green, he was reptilian. They didn't know what species he was. I got to fill all that stuff in. He's named Fellini. Fellini? That's from Fellini. That's the Italian director. I just love the name.
From Fellini, that's awesome. That's so clever.
Yeah, and so we did a lot of stuff, and also I got to, when they did those, I got a set of the cards when they were all done, a box set, and I wish I'd gotten them autographed. But the I was flipping through it, and there's a picture of Princess Leia sitting naked on a bed,
Hmm.
artfully so, in such
Hmm.
a way that you can't see anything.
Right.
It's a G-rated picture,
Hmm.
but it's like, oh, I got really interesting mail from people saying, oh, yeah, Princess Leia naked. Well, she does take off her clothes once in a while, and she does go to the bathroom and take showers and all that stuff. Oh, and I really got hate mail when people were unhappy that Princess Leia might betray Han Solo because of this Feline's pheromones. I said, yeah, but not to spoil it or anything, she didn't. And it's
Strength of character, right?
she needs him in the crotch. I mean, that's
Yeah, it was just I was fascinated with Xizor, particularly the whole falling idea, their hierarchical society, how Vader was involved with the tragedy of their species, the whole thing. The question I wanted to ask you is that George basically became a movie rock star overnight with the popularity of Star Wars, right? The
yes.
Luke, Han, Leia, Billy D. Williams, and Lando Calrissian and Chewie, they became literal American icons overnight.
Yes.
And your job was to take these characters, Dash Rendar, his arch enemy, this fallen Prince Xizor, his replica henchwoman, the perfect ideal female droid Guri. And now you're taking these newly invented characters and you're writing them, building them into the story that already exists. How did you manage that?
Oh, well, I already knew the story existed. Knew it was before, I knew it was after. I knew when it took place. They had left that open. They had refused to let any writers go in and try and fill in that stuff. And so I actually had a chance to fill in the gaps. Where did this happen? How did they get this? Where did that costume come from? Where all of the different places that questions that fans would ask. Well, I got to answer those. Well, where did she get that costume, that Bosch costume? Where did that thermal detonator come from? How did it, what does Vader think about when he's sitting in his hyperoxygenated tank?
Yeah.
It's like, that was one of the biggest appeals. And when I started to write this thing, Tom said, you get to play with Darth Vader. Really? Yeah. And later on, when Reeves and I did the Death Star books, we got to actually go in and redo some of the scenes on the movie from a different point of view.
Yeah.
It's all exactly the same. The dialogue should be exactly the same. But it's now we're not looking at it through Luke's eyes. We're looking at it through someone else's eyes. So the thing about adding new people in, you can't change what's happened to the characters. So, I mean, we know what happened to Luke and Leia and Han. We know where Han was while this thing going. He's on ice. That's the reason we came up with Dash Rendar. We had no Han Solo. And any movie without Han Solo in it, it's not going to be as good as it could be, because he's a rogue. He's an interesting character. They wouldn't let us. We couldn't use him because he was frozen. He was in carbonite. But we could come up with basically Han Solo's younger, cockier brother, and that's who Dash Rendar was.
My goodness, it makes all the sense in the world right now, because when I chat with my friends, when we do like these podcasts, oh, I love, Shadows of the Empire. I love Dash Rendar, but he's a little bit too much like Han Solo. Well, yeah, and I like in light that you're painting it, and it makes total sense. You want to play around with those toys. You want a similar kind of, swaggering, unwilling type of hero archetype, and now you have them in a way of Dash Rendar. This is so fascinating. But when I read Star Wars books, obviously we have the legacy cast. We have Luke, Han, and Leia. Yep. I always enjoy to compare them to a new cast of a particular novel. And your book, this one, has plenty of the new guys. So my question is, where's my question? Okay, I'm situating myself. My questions. It's. I'm looking for my question. Give me a second, guys. Here, I'm sorry. I do apologize.
It's all right. It's a second language. It's understandable.
Yeah.
Think about it in Russian.
This is what I wanted to ask. I love my film cast, but they're already, as you mentioned earlier, they're familiar to me, and I know the whole setup with how they're gonna pretty much operate through the story. But I always compare them to the newer cast. So, as an author, how do you try to separate them or contrast them from the characters that we do know and make them interesting and stand tall in their own right?
Well, you have more freedom. The first thing is that you can't really do too much to any of the main characters. They're where they are when they got there, and where they're going to be after this is over. So you're limited in what you're able to do with them insofar as their changes, because they have to be the characters that they are in the next movie. They have to be, I mean, they're constraints. Whereas with new characters, you can do anything. You can have them be anything, do anything, go anywhere, think anything. They have to have similar traits in that they're action heroes in an action hero franchise, but they need to be similar enough in the sense that they're all characters in the same universe, and they're character types, they're archetypes. But at the same time, I can give them any kind of backstory that I want, where they, and I can link them together. And that's the other thing that's fun, is that you can interlink all these characters to each other in ways that, with the ability of hindsight, you can retcon, you can go in and basically redo certain sequences of certain kinds of interaction, because you already know how they're going to react and behave and what they're going to say. And when they did the graphic novels, there's some great scenes in the graphic novels where you look at them and you go, oh yeah, that's because they know what's going on. You can say something the audience is going to fall over laughing at because they know too, and the characters don't know.
Nice. I immediately remember, it's been so long since I read this book, and I have just such a huge reading list that I rarely reread my books. But the ones that I know and remember that I loved are the ones that leave a lasting impression with the characters. For me, Star Wars with action was always a secondary thing. Lightsabers and laser swords and spaceships. That's all exciting and fun, but I always gravitated towards the characters. And it was the new cast, Dash Rendar and a couple of extra minor characters there that help us navigate into Xizor's palace, and there's kind of things they do, almost like a heist type of storyline. I always kind of was interested in those. Mr. Perry, before we move on, I also wanted to talk about your Battle Surgeons duology, the Medstar. I guess to wrap it up with Shadows of the Empire, how happy were you were with the end results when you just finished the book, and what do you think about it in retrospect now?
I was very happy. They were very good about what they wanted to change and didn't want to change. One of my favorite stories is I wanted to do a scene from the droid's viewpoint. I wanted to have the droids flying the ship, R2 and 3PO. And they said, no, can't do that. We can't do a scene from their viewpoint. I said, why? And they said, because we don't do this. They didn't want me to do it. I said, okay, here's the deal. Let me write the scene. I'll write it in such a way that it's a set piece. It'll just fall in between here and here. And if you don't like it, I'll pull the whole scene out and we could drop it completely, or I can put whatever you want in there. And they said, well, okay, but we don't think we're going to like it. And so I wrote the scene, I sent it off, I waited, and it was going, oh, well, they're not going to like it. Then I got back a call from Tom. He said, you don't want to hear what Star Wars people had to say about that scene? I said, yes. And can you make it longer? I said, oh, yes, I can make it longer.
That's awesome.
because the way I did it was the whole scene takes place over the radio. You hear what they're doing. You don't see them in control. And they're talking, and Luke's going, well, what are you doing now? And so there's this whole sequence. And it was great fun. There was one other scene where I basically wanted to have pull up to a gas station to use the telephone, and they wouldn't let me do that one because it was funny. And the one argument that I had with them that I lost, that they were wrong about, was whether or not R2 could speak, whether Luke and R2 could understand each other. Luke didn't speak Mech, but he would talk to R2, and R2 would and they would have a conversation. Right. And so I went through the movies with a stopwatch, and every place that I had an interaction between those two, I marked it. I timed it. I said, here, and here. This is where they're talking to each other, and it's not like Lassie, where the dog kind of understands what little Timmy wants from them. No, they absolutely had a conversation, and they knew. They said, no. Somebody in one of the books wrote it down that the only time that R2 could speak English, it was being translated through the ship controls. And I said, you're wrong. And they said, it's ours. I said, okay, fine.
I always interpreted that also as a child, when your first impression is you as a viewer interact with the story, make it your personal experience. Even with the cheap Russian single voiceover dubbing, because we couldn't get legal tapes over back in Russia there, everything was dubbed with one person dubbing the whole movie, and sometimes the translation was off. Even there, I remember when Luke is on Dagobah with R2, He's talking to the little guy. He understands what he's saying. They have an exchange there. He wasn't just petting him there verbally and saying, "Oh, good little pet," you know.
No. It's what happens is that you get nailed down. You write something and it becomes part of the canon. And before Disney took it over, canon was different. And so they said, no, you can't do this because somebody in one of the books said this, and we're stuck with it. So okay, fine, I can understand that's what it is. You know, in the early comics, did you ever see the puka, the rabbit, the green rabbit? Dax,
of course.
The rabbit. Yeah. Oh, they wish that one to go away. Nobody wanted to talk about that anymore. It is they didn't know how successful this was going to be, and they didn't know what they were going to have to live with. And so that as writers came along, as the series progressed, as the books came along, we were all given a CD, which was basically a compendium of everything that we knew about Star Wars that we could use and what we couldn't use, and you had to use that as the background. They call it the holocron.
Nice.
And I have a couple of them, and they were numbered and marked, and you had to keep them, out of public view. But you realize that you had to go back and really retroactively, fix some of this stuff because they didn't know when they said this. We had Leland Shee was my continuity guy. He knew all the stuff about that. And so if I had a question, there was a problem. If I wrote something down, Leland would catch it, and he would come back and say, okay, here's the problem. Okay, good. I can do that. I can fix it. I'm not going to mess up anything. And then, of course, everything from springs off there, stuff that I created for this book have taken on lives of its own. There's my martial arts running out, doing over here. I've got the Black Sun Crime Syndicate. We've got all these other things. And they're all sort of slowly coming back into canon. Disney is taking
Black Sun, yes.
Oh, yes, we're going to put this over here. And now, it's canon now. Well, Dash Rendar is supposedly on his way in. And so it'll be interesting to see what they do. It doesn't matter to me. I mean, whether it's canon or whether it's legends, it really doesn't matter.
I'm the same way. I preach on my channel. I'm a relatively small YouTube channel now, but I always preach it, guys. It's all Star Wars. It's all fiction. Enjoyed. Please don't bicker amongst the sides. But when I saw in Star Wars animated series, I can't place the episode. I think it was already in Star Wars Rebels. When they show those Fallen Black Crime Syndicate, I gasped a little bit. I was like, can we get Prince Xizor too, please? Because he's like one of the most amazing characters. But Mr. Perry, I'll tell you, as a huge video gamer myself, this book as a backbone of the whole crossover event that was Shadows of the Empire. There's so many young kids and young adults and people my age coming, the Shadows of the Empire, Nintendo 64 game. Oh my God, it was my entire childhood. Or PlayStation owners, the Terraskazi game, martial arts, where you actually had Mara Skywalker that you could unlock. People are fascinated about this stuff. Your story has so much life and vitality in it that I strongly believe, and I really hope that it becomes part of these essential reprint legends, because honestly, I'm not hyping you up. I'm being completely genuine. This is as freaking as good as Star Wars literature gets. It's so exciting. It captures the spirit of it. But there's another duology that I wanted to talk to you about.
Oh, yeah.
A set of books that completely blew my mind. I'm a fan who went into theaters to watch The Phantom Menace when I was 19 years old, graduating from high school, moving on to study animation. And I happen to be one of the fans who was less than thrilled with the prequel trilogy. It didn't coincide with my imagination of the original films, but more so than anything else, and guys, please don't crucify me yet again. It's just my personal opinion of one fan, and I completely love and accept the fact that a generation of fans grew on those films. I just didn't feel that they were particularly well-crafted pictures. It wasn't the fact that it wasn't what I didn't want to see or wanted or expected from Star Wars. I just didn't feel that the cinema was well-crafted, what was tight enough, and writing and everything else. Anyway, long story short, here comes the expanded universe, and for a fan like me, saves the day. Because I start delving into this whole clone era that George Lucas wanted to tell. This ancient wizard that I pictured, the emperor, now becomes a chancellor. And he's seemingly a good guy. Now there's these noble Jedi who seem to be kind of egotistical and think that they have all the answers. The narrative shifts in a major way. And they start rippling these storylines into the expanded universe. And I say, okay, maybe I didn't like the movies. Let me see what the books are all about. Let me give them a chance. It was Shatterpoint. There was Labyrinths of Evil. It was a fantastic book, Cloak of Deception by James Luceno, one of my favorite authors. And then I get to Medstar, Battle Surgeons, and Jedi Healer. Both books are co-written in 2004 in June and then in September by yourself and Michael Reeves. And it just blew my top off. It just completely amazed me because it was such an interesting and different take on Star Wars for me. So it was, guys, for those of you who are not familiar, very quick overview. It's a collaboration between Mr. Perry and Mr. Michael Reeves. And it's basically conceptualizing the ideas of, what are my thoughts? I'm gathering my thoughts here, guys. Give me a second.
It's medical. It's if you were a fan of the MASH TV series or movies,
right.
It's MASH. It is the medical, what you do in a war zone, how you deal with this kind of stuff, and it's the doctors and it's the healers.
Yeah. So the first idea, thank you. You kind of spotted me there a little bit. I appreciate it. I just have so many things I'd like to talk to you about. I wanted to ask first and foremost. Now I'm reading a book which is a collaboration. So I wanted to ask, what is the process of conceptualizing ideas versus working solo as an author? Now you're having a partnership, and how do you delegate duties, and how do you overcome your creative differences and work together as a unit to tell one story?
Well, it was relatively easy for this because Reeves and I had written stuff together before. We met when we were beginning writers at a conference and kind of connected, and we kicked story ideas back and forth, and we actually wrote several books together. Originally what happened was, just because Reeves was a little further down the path than I was a junior author, so I would pretty much write, we would talk about things, we'd go back and forth, what do you think about this, what do you think about that? We'd come up with general ideas for the story, then I would write a draft and send it to him, and he would rewrite the draft and send it back to me, and we would go back and forth on any small details we wanted to fix, and that's pretty much how we would do a novel. But it changed over the years. What happens is, as you get better as writers, you have different ways of looking at things. Most of the time we work together, I would write a first draft, and then he would do a rewrite. And I was happy to do that because I did most of the work, but I was also getting to write most of what I wanted to write. It's easier just to let it sit there and fix it up than it is to have to go back and rewrite it completely. So that was good. But over the years, and I collaborate with other people, it varies. And so when we did the Medstar books, we were at a point where we had characters in there we liked. Each of us liked a particular character or characters. And so I would say, okay, fine, I'm going to write a chapter. Here we go. And I'll send it to you, and you write the next chapter. And then it came back to me, and I would write the next chapter. And we would basically literally send this book back and forth, send the files back and forth and just keep adding to it. Most of the time, because Reeves is was at the time what I call a cool writer. He did from the neck up. He was very intellectual. His characters did a lot of talking and thinking stuff. They didn't feel as much. Whereas I was kind of a lower body person. I was more into writing about feelings and energy and what you smelled and tasted and heard rather than just what you thought or said. And so we put those two things together. We would have, other than the jokes we used to make where we'd say, well, I do all of the verbs and nouns and he does all the adjectives and adverbs. We would go back and forth and try and blend into a style. When you collaborate with somebody, what you wind up with is a book that neither one of you is completely happy with because some of the stuff that you wanted is not there and some of the stuff that they wanted is. And you go, well, I don't know if I'd have done it that way, but it's ours, it's not mine, it's not his. And so you have to be willing to give on things that, if it were just yours, you would do it differently. But I thought they were pretty satisfactory. At the end of it, we worked about the same amount of work on those two books.
Right.
So
it's basically a compromise, as I understand it, and everything works in service of the story, right? Sometimes even your favorite chunks, just like in cinema, it ends up on the cutting room floor because it doesn't serve the story, or slows down the pace and so forth.
Yes.
Yes. What
most of those chunks were his.
Your will overpowered his will, right? And that's how it was.
You could say the same thing.
Yeah. It's when I was reading also, I'm a huge Dragonlance fan, and Margaret Waits and Tracy Hickman, just like their books, when I read your duology, there's such amazing synergy. It doesn't only feel like one mind wrote it. It felt like a real story. Like I'm interacting with real people where in previous Star Wars books when I read, you dealt with these heroic, larger than life, classical Greek heroes in a way,
Yes.
Proverbial puffed up chest, and they're able to take on all the challenges. And here we're dealing with regular people on the front line. We have surgeons, we have reporters, we have blockade runners, we have smugglers, and we have one Jedi apprentice. And guys, keep in mind, for those of you who are watching, this is before the Star Wars Clone Wars television series kicked off in 2007. So by this timeline, Barriss Offee is basically a film prop. She quickly appears in the background in one of the episodes. I could be mistaken. My memory is not so fresh on the Dark Horse Clone Era novels, books that I've read. But I think she pops in there once or twice. But she's pretty much a brand new character, and you get to write her. So I wanted to ask you, the whole novel is a duology. It read like this gritty war frontline detective novel with, a completely unfamiliar cast. I wanted to ask, what was the main stylistic difference between the story written for prequel films versus this duology?
Well, the duology went off into an area that hadn't really been covered very much, so we could kind of play with the idea of what are they doing out there,
right?
What's actually going on, and I love Clone War. The animated stuff was, that just went to a place that was like, well, gee, that was really nice, but we wanted to go someplace that people hadn't gone. We pitched a couple of books that we thought would be interesting because they were offbeat, because they were smaller stories. We did one that we pitched an idea at one point about the entertainment industry. We had someone who was essentially a rock singer going around who got involved with things, and eventually, they weren't happy with our pitch because we didn't want to use any of the original characters. We wanted it to be all new characters. And so they said, well, no, okay. So we finally put it away. And then later they came back and said, we're still interested in the idea, but what would you think? And I was no longer interested in it. I said, if you're going to make me use some of the characters that you want, who are nice people, but not my story, I don't want to do it. And Reeves said, well, I'll run with it. So he did. He essentially wrote one of his Star Wars novels. It changed around a little bit, but that was the essence of the story. And so, when we were doing the duology, what we wanted to do is write small stories, have it kind of be detective stories. Barriss Offee, and I love the name, barista coffee. That's what Barriss Offee comes from. I mean, we had a minor character that nobody had done anything with, other than just, there's the character. And so what do we do here? We have somebody who is not quite a Jedi, and that gives us the ability to do some things with a Padawan that we might not, they might not be able to let us do. And we got to say some things about slavery in that book, which I thought was fascinating, because in the Star Wars universe, it's there in different forms. The droids are all slaves, they're all property, and yet obviously the smartest character in all of Star Wars is R2-D2. R2-D2 is, for my money, the smartest of all the Star Wars characters. Never fails, always
outlives everyone.
Yep. And he's a thing. He has volition. You see, I'm using the pronouns. The droids, 3PO and R2 and all the other sentient droids are essentially slaves.
Yeah.
They're property. They can be broken down and disposed of at any time, and yet they're obviously intelligent, thinking beings. What do you do with that? And then there's other kinds of slaves that are real slaves, that they're human slaves, and it just kind of gets skated over. Nobody wanted. So we had a chance to play with that a little bit. And Reeves took a couple of those characters from the duology and went and put those in the subsequent novel that he wrote. So we got a chance to play with some things that they didn't really think about, and they like, okay, fine, go, let's see where you go. And they trusted us as writers to do it. So it was fun to do. I mean, plus I have a medical background. I was a physician's assistant. I worked in a doctor's office for 5 years, so all the medical stuff there
figures.
I could make it.
When I was reading it, when I was pitching it to my friends, I used to go to Barnes and Nobles here in Union Square, New York City, and every time somebody would stand by the Star Wars book aisle, I would stand there and start recommending books to them. Oh, you know so much. Oh, it's before Wikipedia. I would start recommending it, and every time I would point to those two books, I would say, if you want to read Tom Clancy set in science fiction world with dark, gritty, mature feel, which reads like Band of Brothers by Steven Spielberg, the HBO miniseries, That's what you get. It felt so seasoned and so mature and so believable versus what I felt was very surface level writing in Star Wars prequel films, almost like George Lucas was trying to break it down to its base elements so younger generation can understand them. Here, it's a complete opposite. I felt like demographically it was geared more towards me. Because once again, you're dealing with a young protagonist like Barriss Offee, who I think represents some of the best concepts of a young spiritual learner, not just throwing around lightsaber and combating other foes, but dealing with the inner world, the spiritual component of the Jedi and that transformation, how she changes through the novel. I wanted to ask you, once again, she's a brand new character for you. What informed her? What did you want to infuse this character with?
Well, every character in a good book, which is we always were striving to write and still are, you want every character to have their own arc. Mm-hmm. Short arc of the character goes against the larger arc of the story. So ideally, you want to resolve every character's arc at the end of the book. You want every character to have gone through all the things that they needed to go to, and this is before Order 66. So nobody knew where we were going to go with some of this stuff. You want every character to have a beginning, a middle, and end. You want them to grow, to change. And anytime you have a young Jedi, someone that has powers, the option of what do you do? How do you bring this person to a place where they can control this, where they can utilize this for what we assume is good, because otherwise they'd be on the dark side. The idea is you pick each character that you use, and you want them to fill it's like a puzzle. There's a piece missing here and a piece there, and so that part of that arc was to be a coming of age. Young person coming of age, learning how to deal with life and reality. In
the middle of war.
Yeah, in the middle of war. And of course, war is the great leveler. There's always something going on in war that's hideous and ugly, but there's also in war a lot of people who are brave and who are honest and who sacrifice. I don't think it's glorious. I'm not a fan of it's glorious to fight wars, but I think the idea is, MASH, the series, was an anti-war series. It started out, it was set in Korea, but it was about Vietnam. That's what MASH was about. And it was about people that are on the front lines being tested and having to deal with the horrors of war, people that are getting shot and destroyed just because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so you always want to kind of put that kind of stuff in. Yeah, there's the exciting things. We have the battles in space and stuff and blowing up, and you shoot the stormtroopers and they fall over. You don't see blood and gore going everywhere. It's pretty bloodless. Yeah. The fact that, that they can't hit you when they shoot back. I mean, that scene in the corridor where blind man could have hit anybody there down. It's like the stormtroopers and the red shirts. They go together. The stormtrooper fires and never hits anybody except the red shirt falls over dead. Star Trek. To get back to your question, the idea is that everybody plays a part in a story, and if you put the pieces together well, all of the main characters and the speaking characters, the supporting characters, will all have an arc that takes them from where they were and makes them something different at the end. Sometimes the only difference is that they're dead. Sometimes, the only difference is they got to the end and they died. And sometimes that they learn something new and better and become better people. And as you pointed out earlier, most of the stories that you read, especially short stories and single novels, those are a chunk out of something that happened before and something that will happen after. And this is the interesting part right here. That these characters at the end of this book, some of these characters are going to survive, and they're going to have other lives and do other things that are going to be interesting. And I could write a book about it. That's what happens if you get an interesting enough character. You can just keep following them and their children and their grandchildren into infinity.
Yeah. I think that was the main appeal to me. It was completely a great contrast between previous Star Wars novels that I read. It was this dark and gritty realism, but it still felt like Star Wars. And the last question I wanted to ask you in regards to this duology, nowadays when we are a generation which is oversaturated with content, there's streaming media, there's a bunch of video game stories, you could entertain yourself from early morning till evening and not have enough, not have a fill. And Star Wars fans constantly, passionately talk about respecting the source material, respecting the source material. We have the Rings of Power Amazon show on screen now, and everybody is a critic now. Everybody criticizes the show, whether it adheres to the source or not. We had the Obi-Wan Kenobi show that came out on Disney Plus. Half of the fandom says, yes, it's exactly how George Lucas portrayed his character in the trilogy. It honors the original saga. Others, like myself, are less complimentary. We say, well, it kind of deviates from the character that I remember as a kid growing up with the original trilogy. I wanted to ask you, in regards to this duology, which I mentioned felt darker and grittier, how do you, as an author, do the balancing act of approaching that and doing greater realism and war themes, but also making it entertaining enough and make it fill into that space opera saga that it feels native to Star Wars?
It's tricky. I think you have to have a feel for it. You really have to know enough of the material to think, okay, so what is going to honor the best? What is going to add to the story overall, as opposed to, I know not all of them, but I knew many of the people who were writing Star Wars novels personally. We worked in the same field. I could probably name 10 that wrote Star Wars books that I thought were pretty decent, and there's a couple that wrote Star Wars books that I think they missed the mark. It's not that they were not good writers; they were. It's that they didn't get the sensibility of Star Wars. I mean, I love Barbara Hamilton's book, and I like Barbara.
Right.
Barbara and I used to hang out together when I was going down to LA and trying to write for movies and stuff, and not getting very far. But there are people then, and I'm not going to mention the names of the people that I didn't think hit the mark, but there are some that have written books, and universally fans don't like them. It's not because the books are bad. It's because they don't have that Star Wars feel. And I think in order to it's your judgment, and it's being watched over by the producers. But the idea is, you need to write something that if you were sitting at home watching it on TV or reading the book, you would think, oh, they got this. This is Star Wars. And the whole idea of gritty, I mean, look at the Star Wars stuff that I did. I kind of like to go to the gritty side a little bit, because it lets people, it reveals character. Nothing reveals character more than stress. What do you do when you're in a situation where this happens, and not just have it be a cartoon? Oh, well, I'm the hero, I'll just kick his ass and move on. What you do, what you hope as a writer, is that you reveal that people have frailties, and that they have to deal with not being brave, and not feeling brave, and doing the job anyway. It's this classic literature where you put somebody into a pressure cooker and you cook them and you see what they do. I think probably when you're dealing with something, I mean, Shadows of the Empire was about the underground. It's about the criminals, and it was dark. And I got some interesting mail about how dark it was. And I think it was a good choice for them to have picked something like that out, because it needed a little touch of that. The grit in, I think, more so in the duology, is that it's medical and people are dying.
Yeah.
And you don't get to see a lot of that in Star Wars. You see a lot of stormtroopers falling over. You see a lot of people getting blown up, and a lot of robots being blown up. But it's not. It's sort of bloodless. There's no real sense that these are suffering people. You do the one about the stormtrooper who takes off his helmet and goes home, and he has a wife and the kids, and he has a dog and all this stuff. And then when you kill him, it makes it a lot more interesting than he's just a stormtrooper. He's just a spear carrier. And there have always been spear carriers in literature and on stage and in movies. There are people that come out and their job is to get killed, and you don't care about them because you're not supposed to. You don't want to get into that. When you're dealing with people being blown up or shot or operated on, it's a little bit harder. And you just have to make sure it is Star Wars. It's still Star Wars. It has that feel. You want it to have that feel, because if you don't have that feel, then that's not what you're writing. When we did Death Star, everybody already knows the story. There's no way to get around it. It's like doing Titanic. The boat sinks at the end. There's no way to avoid that. So what do you do to get there? Everybody knows the Death Star is going to get blown up more than once. The next one's going to be blown up too. But so how do you make that interesting? Well, people, I know how it ends. Well, yeah, we all know how everything ends. We all die. But so what do you do on the trip? How do you do it? So you people that with characters who are under stress, who are dealing with the realities that you give them to deal with, and I always wondered, the guy who pulled the lever to fire to have the Death Star, blow up the planet. What was he thinking? How do you justify that to yourself? I just blew up the planet and killed billions of people. Yeah, I think about that. Maybe you hesitate a second. That became the basis for a character. So,
Mm-hmm.
It's the questions. It's a classic science fiction questions. You ask yourself, what would happen if? What if this guy who did this was that? And then how do I deal with that? Or how do I take a character and get inside his or her head and ask questions that I will know the answers to?
Mm-hmm.
Why did you do that? It's classic journalism. Who, where, what, when, why, and how. Those are the questions that you have to answer in any story that you write, and that's my job. If I miss it, if I don't do it, I'm not doing my work.
Yeah, and I know I think for me personally, these are the stories that stand the test of time, and what seems to be sometimes lost in translation. And I don't want to say it's the modern times, the modern filmmakers. There's still plenty of talented filmmakers working in the industry today, still producing good cinema. It's just sometimes the extravagant part, the eye candy, all the CGI effects and the big ships and explosions and robots, that kind of takes the center stage. But it's not why we remember and love something that penetrates the heart, and you carry those characters for years and years and years. And even sometimes, even like it's the visual moment and the nuance that you put in the Shadows of the Empire. To this day, I sit and I visualize that throne room of Xizor and his interaction with Leia, and how he is not only manipulating her, but he's also trying to seduce her, and how that strength of character and desire to save Han, because she's already gave her soul to him, to this man, and that little tension there, it stays with you for years. Just a small scene, which, it doesn't complete the story, it doesn't give you everything. Just one scene enters your mind and stays with you for years.
But at one point, somebody suggested, and I'm not going to mention who, that we have her sleep with Xizor. We go ahead and have that happen. And I said, I'm not writing that. I don't want to be hanged.
Yeah.
I don't want to be chased down with a bunch of Star Wars fans with pitchforks and torches and wanting to stab me. No way is that going to happen. Not on my watch. You get somebody else to write that. I'm not going to have anything to do with that. And they said, oh, yeah, well, you're probably right. No, I'm right. Trust me. I got lots of nasty comments just about the fact that she was even considering it. So she wasn't considering it. She was being overwhelmed by chemicals. It's like giving somebody a drug. But it didn't matter. People build up an image of a character in their head, and they know what that character is going to do or not do.
Yeah.
And if you deviate from that too far, they will not forgive you.
I loved every minute of it, sir. I loved when you put your characters in a precipice, and we don't know what's going to happen to the next, like that almost near-death experience or near, seduction kind of like thing. That's where characters revealed. That's where we learn who these people. That's who they learn who they are.
Yes.
Because, we think sometimes in our heads too much, and we think we are our thoughts. And then when the moment of truth comes, and you're either a coward or you step on the gas pedal and you throw the Millennium Falcon there and you help Luke Skywalker defeat the Death Star, that's what defines you as character. And when you, in your novels, you were able to do it and made me care for simple people that I don't even remember, like the Sullustan that you had in your book. I'm trying to remember his name. I don't. But the important thing to me personally is that I could relate to him as a person. I could relate to him sitting there in the cantina, staring at the screen and worrying about the war and the supply shortage and what the Republic is doing and how we're being tossed here and forgotten in this world where back there is so important. I cared.
Well, that's
was important.
my job. And if I do that, then I'm doing a good job. And if I don't, I've missed it.
I think you're doing an amazing job at legions of Star Wars fans can attest to that. Mr. Perry, look, I had like tons of questions prepared, even with your Conan books. I don't want to take too much more of your time. Before I ask my last two questions, I just wanted to thank you very much. It's an honor meeting you and speaking with you, and thank you for the work that you have done for Star Wars, outside of Star Wars. I look forward to introducing myself to your work with Conan, which I haven't got to yet. I'm a huge Robert E. Howard fan, and I hope you reinvent the character in a meaningful way that I can take away and say, yes, this author wrote it, not that one.
Read the last one. The first, I wrote 5 of them. The first 4 were, they were big stories. They were wizards and warlocks and all the stuff, and Conan does what Conan does. But the last one was, I'm going to see if I can get back to Conan's roots, and so I made it a smaller story, and I thought it was the best of the 5. The rest of them, yeah, they paid bills. There was Conan the Hot Tub, and Conan the College Tuition, and Conan the Roof Repair. And there was one Conan the Vegetarian, although that's not what it was called. He never ate any meat. Every time he'd go into a place to get something to eat, they would be out of everything. We'd have to want to eat cheese and bean sprouts or whatever.
Mm-hmm. I'll definitely give him a shot. Once again, thank you, Mr. Perry. So my last question for today is, which of your work are you most proud of, and what message would you have for Star Wars fans watching, reading, or playing Star Wars today?
It's one of the questions that writers get asked a lot, and my answer is kind of stock. It's kind of like asking, what is your favorite child?
Yeah.
It's hard to say. There are books that accomplish different things. There are books that I was really proud of because of a thing that went on in it. There are books that I wasn't all that enthused about it and kind of got into it and wound up turning out a book better than I thought it was. It usually is the work in progress. Whatever work you're on now is, well, this is one that I'm the most proud of because it's going to be the best, because it's still unwritten. You don't know what it's going to be. But I have to say, as the Star Wars work, Shadows of the Empire was by far and away the most fun, because it was a big collaborative project. It reached a lot of people. I had millions of people that read that book. Anything that I put in there, I put in a whole bunch of Easter eggs. That's what they call them now. They didn't used to call them that. Names and places and bits and stuff that I did along the way. And somebody caught them. Almost every one of them they caught, because there's enough audience that somebody's going to pick it up and go, what does that mean? And they're going to go check it out. I was fond of my martial arts trilogy, or it started out as a trilogy, wound up being 8 or 9 books, and there's one more in the Matadors, because it let me use my martial arts and stuff in a way that I thought was really interesting. And the Clancy books, I was able to introduce Pinch X a lot to the American audience. As far as I know, that's the first widely read series of books that use that art. And I have had a number of people say to me, I got into this because I read that Clancy book and I thought this looks like fun, and I went and found a teacher. That's good. That's you're actually influencing people. But as for new Star Wars readers, I think the thing is you come to it with whatever mindset you come to it with. If you're young, you're going to get a different thing than if you're older. If you've seen all of the movies from the get-go, the new movies are going to come along. They're going to carry with them something that a new reader or a watcher who's never seen or read any of this stuff, they're not going to bring that to you, and they're going to look at that and they're going to go, wow, that's interesting, in a way that you won't. And so you have to kind of remember, y'all get to be young once. Everybody gets to be young once. Everybody gets to go to this movie a virgin and not have seen it before and go, oh wow, the stuff that you found fascinating when you were 18, maybe 18-year-olds won't find fascinating today, but on some level they're going through the same kind of process. And if you appeal to that, that's good. I think the idea is there's so much material out there you can choose from. And if you like it, you can find the stuff that you like. And if you don't like the rest of it, you don't like it. I have to be honest with you. I like almost all of it. Some of it not as much as others. Some of it I thought they missed the mark and they could have done better. But even so, there's very few of the things that I've seen and watched or read that I would say, I wish they hadn't done that. I just, the Force notwithstanding, I don't need midi-chlorians. Thank you kindly. But I'm not the only person that thinks that. So, and I don't think Jar Jar was the most interesting character anybody came up with either, but I understand what they were doing and why they were trying to do it and who they were trying to appeal to, and it wasn't me. I have a lot of trouble watching movies and reading books now, because I've been a writer for so long that I can see the strings in a lot of places. Yeah. And as soon as the movie comes on, if I'm 5 minutes in, if I'm able to recite the dialogue before it comes up, now he's going to say this, and then she's going to say that, and it's what they call on the nose. It's like a paint by numbers. Yeah. It's somebody who is doing the job but not very well. I like to be surprised, but I recognize that I'm not the audience that you're writing movies or books for, because there's not enough of meat around to keep you in business. You write for a broader audience, and you're going to have a wide swath of people. If you're a fan, if you're into it, read the stuff that you like. So listen to old music that you listened to when you were 19. You can go back and listen to those records now. those recordings are just as good as they were. You know, you may not be the same person, but you can remember what it felt like when you heard that.
Mm-hmm.
If there's new stuff come along, you look at it and go, I don't know. I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with Endor. I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with whatever comes along, because it's potential. It could be great. Yeah. Was Obi-Wan exactly what I wanted? Maybe not, but you know, there was stuff in there. There was a Feline in Obi-Wan that pops up. I know who that is. I know what that character. You know, it's kind of fun to be part of it, but you're already part of it. If you were a fan, if you watch this stuff, you're a part of it. You're the audience. You're the people that they make these things for.
Yeah.
It's not all going to be for you. It's like going to a restaurant. You're not going to like every dish, but you know, the ones that you like, those are the ones you eat.
Yeah. You know, for the ending, I'd like to say this, that the first book I ever read on my own was a trick of my father just dropping it on my desk at my room. And I came after school and was just laying there. I was going to put it back on the shelf. And I turned the page and it said Treasure Island by Stevenson. And once I read that, life was never the same again. And, you know, he threw me into this new world. And I realized that a good story could be written 100 years ago or thousands of years ago, like Homer's Iliad, and it's timeless. If something is good and it's timeless. And guys, my personal message is the whole sole reason of me starting my YouTube channel, not as a career, and my Facebook group, is I got tired of hearing people bashing this side of Star Wars, that side of Star Wars. My only mantra that I present to people is, look, keep an open mind. Even if you were disappointed here, somewhere along the lines, maybe a stroke of genius will happen, because you can't have genius on demand. Sometimes it takes time. It takes a reformative process where they rethink it, revision it, make mistakes along the way. I would say, guys, check out parts of the canon. Go back if you're 16, 17, if you've never read it before. And I see younger people talking to me online and saying, did you read The Shadows of the Empire? I'm like, yeah, some 20 years ago. Yeah, I've read it. I know what's up. But keep an open mind, guys. You might find a treasure for yourself amongst this rack of older books or newer books. It's all Star Wars. It could all have potential for you. Like Mr. Perry said, in the upcoming show, Andor, we don't know what's there, but the potential is always that if we hope for the best, maybe the best will come. Mr. Perry, once again, it's been a complete delight chatting with you. Guys, if you don't know what this is still, please go out, check out this novel. We'll drop Mr. Perry's all relevant links in this video description below. Go check out his work. There's plenty of stuff on Amazon. You could check beyond Star Wars. Steve Perry does not need my introduction. He's a renowned American author, and I was delighted to have him. And for everyone who is watching, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel, but please don't forget to check out his work. And we'll see you all next time. Thank you so much. Take care, guys.